against tyranny and oppression, to love, to dream, and to aspire for freedom and self-determination. While the freedom and democracy Filipinos have achieved thus far as a people may not be perfect yet, but still we hope that it can serve as an inspiration to other peoples in the world who are today fighting for survival, for freedom, and recognition, including our very own First Nations people here in Australia. So we are so fortunate in Canberra. We have such talented and dedicated Filipinos with us who have enabled us to put together this poetry play. This is truly a community endeavor. This play is co-written by Dr. Merlinda Bobis and Marlene Tata. She will take her seat here later on, and of course directed by Dr. Merlinda Bobis with some assistance from us here. So ladies and gentlemen, the Philippine Australian Association is proud to present to you Pride and Protest, Filipino Poetry Through the Years. It's always like that.
Why don't you just forget about me? I know there are others you are more interested in. I have decided to give up on this love, so I won't have the pain of despair any longer. This is the translation of what we heard, ancient Philippine poetry. We welcome you to this cultural treasure, which we should not forget. This is the Kapripakan, an excerpt from the Darangen, the epic poem of the indigenous Maranaos from the Lake Lanao region of Mindanao. With 17 cycles and 72,000 lines, the Darangen celebrates episodes from Maranao history and the tribulations of their mythical heroes. Declared a national cultural treasure of the Philippines, in 2005, it was included in the Proclamation of Oral and Intangible Heritage of Humanity by the UNESCO. That Darangen excerpt, which we just heard, was chanted in Maranao by Princess Sindao Banisil, daughter of a Maranao Sultan. Raised as a princess from a young age, Princess Sindao learned Maranao culture, playing different instruments, dance, and chanting the Darangen. At celebrations, she chanted the epic as her people's poetess and philosopher. The Darangen is one of 23 folk epics collected from 14 ethno-linguistic groups in the Philippines. From north to the south of the archipelago, our indigenous peoples have always chanted poetry about their stories. So Philippine poetry has been thriving from pre-colonial times to this day. Philippine pre-colonial poetry was mostly oral, but we can proudly look to the indigenous Hanoomanyans of Mindoro who were writing poems using their own script, the Surat Mangyan, long before the Spaniards arrived. They continue to write their poems to this day. These poems are called ambahan, usually written on bamboo and sand. Here's an example of an ambahan. Now, Spanish colonization began when the conquistador Ferdinand Magellan landed on the shores of the country in 1521. This did not stop us from celebrating our own stories in poetry, which sometimes served as protest against colonial Spain, even if poetry began developing in the Spanish and European traditions. Some poets continued writing in their own language, like the great Francisco Balagtas, mentioned earlier, I heard by our Consul General here. He did his research. Who wrote his famous epic romance, Florante at Laura, which was first published in 1838. This poem is about, as you can may glean from the title, about two lovers, Florante and Laura. Now, born into a life of poverty, Balagtas became a servant to a wealthy family in Tondo. His master saw his love for books and encouraged him to get educated. But he fell in love. He fell in love with Maria Rivera. Unfortunately, he had another suitor, Mariano Capule, a man of influence. Capule got Balagtas arrested on trumped-up charges and imprisoned. And while in prison, Balagtas wrote Florante and Laura in Tagalog, one of the many languages in the archipelago.
Inaasam-asam na kahit isang dali, masasarili ko ang dikit mong pili. Nang aking masabing, poon kang may-ari, ng buhay ko, puso, sa sintay lugawi. I always look forward to but one brief moment, when your rare beauty will be for my eyes alone. For then I can say that you're the mistress who rules my life and this heart languishing for love.
Well, in this excerpt, with its English translation, Florante addresses his beloved and seemingly unattainable Laura, echoing Balagtas' own hapless tale of the heart. But perhaps his literary masterpiece is more than a love story.
sa loob at labas ng bayan kong sawi. Kaluluhay siyang nangyayaring hari. Kagaling at bait ay nalulugami, ininis sa hukay ng dusa't bighati. All over my hapless country, treason has established its reign, while goodness and wisdom lies prostrate, buried alive in the grave of grief.
Literary critics argue that Balagtas' epic romance, the theme of love connects with the theme of patriotism. Florante at Laura is also an interrogation of injustice, oppression, social inequity, and bad governance. Perhaps it heralds the spirit of revolution against Spanish colonial rule.
The father of the Philippine Revolution, which began in 1896, Andres Bonifacio, was also a poet. Bonifacio wrote the emotionally gripping poem, Pag-ibig sa Tinubuang Lupa, which means love for native land. He wanted to spark patriotism and the fight for independence against colonial Spain. Aling pag-ibig pa ang hihigit kaya sa pagkadalisay at pagkadakil, gaya ng pag-ibig sa tinubuang lupa? Aling pag-ibig pa? Wala naman, wala. Ulit-ulitin mang basahin ang isip at isa-isahing talastasing pilit ang salita't buhay na limbag at tibig ng isang katauhan, ito'y namamasid.
Aling pag-ibig pa ang hihigit kaya sa pagkadalisay at pagkadakila, gaya ng pag-ibig sa tinubuang lupa. Aling pag-ibig pa, wala na nga wala, walang mahalagan, kundi nihandog ng pusong mahal sa bayang nakuko. Dugo, yaman, tunong, katikisan, pagod, buhay may abutin, magkalagot-lagot.
We heard an excerpt from Andres Bonifacio's poem, which was composed into a song by Luis Salvador Jorge and popularized by the contemporary music duo Inang Laya, known for their feminist and protest songs against martial law and the Marcos dictatorship. So, the poem's spirit of protest stretched from the 1800s to the 1970s. Bonifacio's poem, Pag-ibig sa Tinubuang Lupa, continues to be relevant to this day. Its first and key stanza asks the crucial question: what love is greater in purity and nobility than the love for native land? What love? Certainly none. None.
Love is a revolutionary cry. Just Steering is one of the most famous poems of the Spanish colonial period. The farewell poem of Dr. Jose Rizal before his execution. Rizal was a brilliant scholar, a medical doctor, a polyglot conversant in at least 10 languages. He was a poet, essayist, a novelist, whose two books, No Limitangere and El Filibusterismo, formed the nucleus of literature that inspired dissent among peaceful reformists and spurred militancy of armed revolutionaries against colonial Spain. Adios, patria adorada.
Región del Sol querida. Nuestro perdido, perla del mar de Oriente, nuestro perdido Edén. A darte voy alegre la triste mustia vida, y fuera más brillante, más fresca, más florida. También por tu la diera por tu bien.
En campo de batalla, luchando con delirio, otros te dan sus vidas, sin dudas, sin pesar. El sitio nada importa, ciprés, laurel o lirio, cadalso o campo, abierto, combate, cruel martirio. Lo mismo es si lo piden la patria y el hogar. Those were the first two stanzas of Jose Rizal's Último Adiós, my last farewell. Rizal was charged by the colonial Spanish government with rebellion and sedition. He was imprisoned and sentenced to death. The night before his execution, he wrote his farewell poem. He hid it. In an oil lamp, which he gave to his sister Trinidad, telling her in English that something was hidden in it. This is supposedly Rizal's oil lamp. But according to some investigating writers now, it was actually not a lamp, but a small stove for warming food. So, not a lamparilla, but a cocinilla. Question. The point and the fire from the lamparilla or cocinilla are a dying man's resistance against colonial despotism, darkness, and death. Philippine national artist Nick Joaquin translated Rizal's poem in English.
I am to die when I see the heavens go vivid, announcing the day at last behind the dead night. If you need color, color to stain that dawn with, let's spill my blood. Scatter it in good hour, and drench in its gold one beam of the newborn light.
On the morning of December 30, 1896, Jose Rizal was executed by firing squad. He did not want to be shot from behind like a traitor. At the moment of his fall, he turned, so he fell with his face to the sun.
Adiós, patria dorada, región del sol querida, perla del mar de oriente, nuestro perdido Edén. La patria, a darte voy alegre la triste angustia vida, y fuera más brillante, más fresca, más florida. También por tu la diera por tu bien.
After the inglorious defeat of the Spanish government in 1898, the Americans took control of the Philippines. English as a literary vehicle came with the American occupation. By 1900, English was the medium of instruction in schools. Pioneers of Philippine literature in English imitated American and British models. But one poet resisted the shift to English. In 1928, Jose Corazon de Jesus, popularly known as Joseng Batute, wrote the iconic poem Bayan Ko, meaning my country, in protest against the American colonizers. And the poem was composed into a song by Constancio de Guzman. It's now an anthem of protest movements. This song continues to be sung at rallies and demonstrations.
Ang bayan kong Pilipinas, lupain ng ginto't bulaklak, pag-ibig ang sa kaniyang palad, nag-alay ng ganda't dilag, at sa kanyang yumi at ganda. Dayuhan ay nahalina, bayan ko, binihag ka, nasadlak sa dusa. himag na sang makaalpas. Pilipinas kong minumutya, pugad ng luha at dalita, aking adhika, makita kang sakdalaya.
That was really heart-rending, heartwarming. Yeah, that deserves a round of applause. Note how poems become songs. Perhaps as a people, we Filipinos are constantly returning to oral poetry. It's our bodies, protesting against the shackles of the print medium, privileged by the West. We return to our roots and the requisite to survival, breathing. When we sing, we work our lungs in tune with the air. American colonization led to many Filipinos traveling to the United States as migrant workers. Among them was writer, poet, worker, and activist Carlos Bulusan, who chronicled the Filipino migrant experience during the 1930s to the early 1950s.
Mysterious, profound, neat. The night scrolls under the moonlight, knotless cables tied to the streets. Synergy of truth, ever present. Giving. Time to what hope delays. O city of strangled throats and deep-set eyes. Give meaning to the muffled cry of millions who perish behind screen windows. Answer the namelessness of these young faces.
Bulusan made visible the millions of nameless migrant laborers in exploitative and racist America. These days, there are nearly 1.9 million Filipino contract workers laboring outside the Philippines. The current overseas Filipino contract worker, the OFW, also speaks out in poetry, like Sally Fariñas, a domestic helper in Hong Kong. And here's an excerpt of her poem she wrote for the daughter she left behind.
Oh God, if only I could fly back home. Instantly, I would leave this place where I slave. I would gather you in my loving arms and never leave again. But life is tough. We must learn to survive. Even if I tell you, you won't understand. Yet, I'll be back soon. Just stand by the window, count your little fingers, recite some nursery rhymes. Just sit the doorsteps, watch the bus pass by. Wait for me, my little one. I'm coming home soon. Sally's poem is a cry of love and longing, and a protest against visibility and forgetting. Little daughter, Mama is still here for you.
So we just had a little detour to the present time, following Bulusan's poem on migrant labor in the US. So now let's return to the Philippines during the American period. At that time, a female poet writing in English was also engaged in a different protest. Angela Manalang Gloria. In the 1920s to the 1940s, female writers were hardly recognized like their male counterparts. Worse, the female experience was either invisible or invalidated by a patriarchal society. And against this context, the poet Angela Manalang Gloria wrote about female emotion and desire, sex, and even illicit relationship.
Oh, to be free at last, to sleep at last as infants sleep within the womb of rest, to stir, and stirring find no blackness vast, with passion weighted down upon the breast, to turn the face this way and that, and feel no kisses festering on it like sores, to be alone at last, broken the seal that marks the flesh, no better than a horse. The hymen, that fold of membrane closing the vagina, is the seal of female virginity, vigilantly guarded by the patriarchs in traditional societies, especially in Catholic Philippines. The poem is supposedly a protest against marital rape. In this poem, Angela Manalang Gloria breaks that social seal, symbolized by the hymen, by exposing it for what it is. The label of virgin and whore are one and the same. Both are marks of patriarchal bondage made on the female body. Oh, to be free of both.
Angela Manalang Gloria's last poems were dedicated to her husband, who was brutally killed by the Japanese in 1945. During the Japanese occupation from 1941 to 1945, Tagalog was favored by the Japanese authorities, who censored literature. Writing in English was consigned to limbo. The common themes of poetry in Tagalog were nationalism, country, love, and life in the barrios. But one of the darkest legacies of Japanese occupation is the comfort women. Comfort, that soft, assuring word, turned vicious, horrific. Filipinas were trafficked by the Japanese Imperial Army for sex to comfort the Japanese soldiers. Filipinas were repeatedly subjected to rape and sexual violence, even torture and inhumane detention. But as we know now, sexual slavery of comfort women did not occur not only in the Philippines, but it occurred as well in other Japanese occupied territories like China, Japan, Indonesia, and of course a lot of these women have asked for reparation and asked for an apology from the Japanese government.
Close enough to the water, I could have leapt to meet the tide. The machines scraped the ground until it gurgled with rubble. They trust you will not mourn what you cannot recall. Tell me who racked their mind for this euphemism, but could not bear to look anyway. Memory antagonizes the act of rape, acceptable savagery. The reminder of a woman raped, intolerable. Too real. Too real. Too real.
Too real!
Rape is too real. again and again in Eunice Andrade's poem, dedicated to comfort women. Eunice Andrade is an award-winning Filipino poet and educator based on Gadigal land in Sydney. This poem is from her latest book of poetry, Take Care, which was the finalist in 5 major Australian literary awards. Her poem responds to the Duterte government's removal of the statue commemorating comfort women from Rojas Boulevard in Manila. Official reason? To give way to a drainage improvement project.
Sources say that this statue of a blindfolded and mourning Filipina was removed after the Japanese Foreign Ministry had objected to it. But Eunice Andrade's poem reinstates the statue and the female body. Eunice Andrade's poem. Look on the left. The woman is removed. Around her is the text about the official removal. But on the right, she is restored, and her voice is restored, reminding us that rape, the original violence, is too real. And so is the tearing down of the memorial against institutionalized rape that forced around 1,000 Filipinas to become comfort women. Too real. And after Japan lost the war in 1945, they were driven out of the Philippines. And on July the 4th, 1946, the Philippines became an independent republic. But wait, the Filipinos had already declared independence from Spain on June 12, 1898, after the revolution. But as history turned out, Filipinos fought a war against colonial Spain, then another war against colonial America, and yet another war against the Japanese invaders. And on that original Declaration of Philippine Independence on June 12, 1898, the Philippine flag was raised. They played the anthem of the revolution, Marcha Filipina Magdalo, composed by Juan Felipe. Soon after, the poem Filipinas was written by a 23-year-old soldier, Jose Palma, as the lyrics of what would become the national anthem in Spanish.
Tierra dorada, hija del sol de oriente, el fuego ardiente en ti latiendo está. Patria de amores, del heroísmo cuna, los invasores no te hollarán jamás.
During the American period, the anthem was translated into English. Land of the Morning by Camilo Ocias and A.L. Lane.
Land of the morning, child of the sun returning, with fervor burning, thee do our souls adore. Land dear and holy, cradle of noble heroes, ne'er shall invaders trample thy sacred shores.
But why should we sing the national anthem in the language of the invader? So the Tagalog version by Felipe Padilla de Leon, Lupang Hinirang, became the Philippine national anthem that we sing today.
Bayang magiliw, perlas ng silanganan, alaw
hinirang, tuwira ka lang magiting, sa manluluping, di ka pasisiin.
So the lyrics of the Philippine national anthem began as a revolutionary poem. That second stanza declares, "Our beloved land will never allow itself to be trampled by a tyrant." Note, tyrant is not qualified as a foreign tyrant because tyranny can be homegrown. This leads us to another crucial time of struggle, the first quarter storm, and martial law being declared in the Philippines on the 21st of September 1972 by then President Ferdinand Marcos. In the first quarter of 1970, the Philippines was plunged into civil unrest. Students, workers, peasants, and members of the urban poor held demonstrations and protest marches against the corrupt and repressive Marcos dictatorship. Fear hung in the air, and protest poetry became the rage. This was the setting of the story of the Lakaba brothers, poets in arms who defied the regime with tragic consequences. Look, Jose Maria Flores Lacaba, or Pete Lacaba, the older brother, and his little brother Emmanuel. Pete Lacaba is a journalist, screenwriter, and poet. His screenplays include Jaguar, which competed at the Cannes Film Festival, Bayan Ko, Kapit sa Patalim, and Ora Pro Nobis. These films exposed ordinary people's lives amidst poverty and injustice. His journalism and poetry did the same with as much passion. But in 1973, a year after martial law was declared, Pete Lacaba published his controversial poem under the nom de plume Ruben Cuevas. Prometheus Unbound. This was Pete Lacaba's poem, published in 1973 during martial law. Prometheus, if you may remember, was a Greek god who was punished and chained to a rock by Zeus because he brought fire to humans. But in Pete's poem, Prometheus was unbound. His poem is an acrostic. Anybody who knows what acrostic means? Professor Mark Turner?
Yes, take the first letters.
Excellent, excellent. That means you'll take the first letters of the poem, and that you would read something. Anyone who could read the first letters downwards? Volet?
It's like I said, because I can do Hitler with the door and
Yeah.
two times like dog in some
Yes.
public.
Marcos, Hitler, dictator, Tumpa, Lakdo. It was published in a Marcos, in a government supported magazine called Focus. He was able to outwit the dictator. It should not have been published. They did not know until it was already published and they saw it. And it was then ordered by the government that all of those magazines that published the poem were recalled. But that was how poetry was, heavily censored during that time. But he tried to outwit the government of the day. Now, Pete Lacaba would later point out that the first line of the poem was a pun. It says, "Mars shall glow tonight," equals martial law tonight. Of course, we all remember we had, what was that? We had to go home. Curfew, we had the curfew. So martial law tonight. He published the poem, as I said, in a state-controlled magazine, Focus. So at that point, he outwitted the dictator. But in 1974, unfortunately, Pete Lacaba was captured and held at Camp Crame, where he was routinely tortured. Many writers, poets included, were imprisoned by the Marcos regime. But like Pete's Prometheus, these poets held fast to their convictions unbound.
Hold fast to the gift of fire. I am rage, I am wrath, and I am ire. The vulture sits on my rock and licks at the chains of emancipation's breath. Reeks of death, death, death.
And death was what awaited Pete Lacaba when he was arrested, released from prison in 1976 through the intercession of his friend Nick Joaquin. At that time, Nick Joaquin was about to receive the National Artist Award, but he said he'd receive the award only if Pete Lacaba was released. But now remember, Pete has a younger brother, Emmanuel, Eman. This boy beside Pete is Eman, as he was known. He was a high school valedictorian, an American field service scholar. Eman grew up to be a superstar writer of his generation. He was a playwright, a poet, an actor, and a typical 1960s bohemian. Then, like his brother, he came into political awakening amidst the ruthless Marcos regime. He joined the armed rebellion, the New People's Army.
You want to know, companions of my youth, how much has changed the wild but shy young poet, forever writing last poem after last poem. You hear he's as dark as earth, barefoot, a turban round his head, a bolo at his side, a ball pen blown up to a long-barreled gun. Deeper still, the struggling change inside.
His ballpoint pen blown up to a long-barreled gun. Eman had become the poet warrior. He visited his brother Pete in jail, and that was the last time they saw each other. Eman was later found in a shallow grave in Davao. He had been shot, summarily executed, and he was only 27 years old. His face was so disfigured, his mother recognized him only because of a cluster of moles. A journalist wrote that one of Pete's first acts as a free man, after he was released from jail, was to actually look for the corpse of his murdered brother.
am looking for my son. They say we have won, but my boy has not come home. They say we have won, but I dig a tomb for him. They say we have won. How can a graveyard hear?
How can a graveyard hear?
How can a graveyard hear?
How can a graveyard hear? Balat at mga matang pakikirutin para gamutin sa sandak ko, na dagat at buwan. Pagkatapos mapapahinaw ng mga bibig ng laman, ititik ko ang mga labi nito at itutulak ang mga hinahin na pira-pirasong kataga, bago sa lalamunan. Skin and eyes to be stung and salved with a palmful of sea and moon. Then the calm of pores. These lips of the skin will shut, and their unintelligible moans will surge to the throat instead, where they will gather to become words. During and after a war, grief will surge to the throat and become words. And protest poetry is born. I am Merlinda Bobis. I'm a poet, novelist, and dramatist. I just performed an excerpt from my epic poem, Kantada ng Babaeng Mandirigma, Daragang Magayon. Cantata of the Warrior Woman, Daragang Magayon, which I wrote and performed in 2 versions, in Filipino and in English. Now this myth, or this epic poem, my epic poem is my reinvention of a myth about an active volcano from my original home region in the Philippines, Bicol, the Mayon volcano, named after a princess, Daragang Magayon, and her name means beautiful maiden. Now, legend has it that Princess Daragang Magayon was forced to marry Datu Pagtuga, a belligerent chief who threatened her tribe with war. And during the wedding, her true love comes to save her, to rescue her. There was a battle, everyone dies, including Daragang Magayon. She got buried and her grave rises into this volcano. Now let us look at the logic of this story. How can a mountain of fire come from a compliant war booty at the mercy of warring men? So, I decided to tell a different story. I reinvented the myth. In my epic poem, Daragang Magayon does not marry Datu Pagtuga. Instead, he fights him in a war to save her tribe. She takes up arms. She becomes the warrior woman. Now this Kantada ng Babaeng Mandirigma, Cantata of the Warrior Woman, Daragang Magayon, is my protest against the wars waged by the state, any state, against its people and against another sovereign people. And as we know, this is the case with the Philippines and Australia, with our respective colonial histories. Thus, we need to find our voices to speak out and protest. You see, we often think of protest as something grim, angry, dark. But it actually comes from a place of light, pride. Pride in what we care about. And it also comes from a tender place, love. Love for country, for home, family, friends, other human beings, all of humanity, and the beyond human world, the land, the air, the waters, and all the creatures living in them. But love, pride, protest are not just Filipino passions. Our First Nations people in Australia and around the world have these passions in spades. And so do the people of Ukraine, Myanmar, Sudan, Yemen, the Congo, Palestine, Syria, Afghanistan. I can keep going on, and many other parts of the world, including those we don't even hear about in the mainstream media. I hope in our hearts we could wish them survival, safety, dignity, and freedom. Like that light from that lamp. Light is not dead. Its fire keeps burning. Ibinabalik ng langit ang iyong mga mata, sinlinaw ng buwan. Ibinabalik ng lupa ang iyong mga labi, nang mahitig sa salita. Ibinabalik ng dagat ang iyong mga suso na ugdan ng latay, ng latay. Sky gives you back your eyes, splinterless as the moon. Earth gives you back your lips to fruit with words. Sea gives you back your breasts without the welts. Gives you back, gives us back, because we touched how hollow the sockets, how barren the mouth, how breasts were marked redly, redly, redly. But we, all of us, remember beyond red. We are in love with a rainbow.
We are returned to ourselves by the sky, the earth, the sea. And on this note of hope, we close our program. We affirm our pride in Philippine literature that has a rich and ongoing tradition of protest poetry because of our history. And our poets continue to write and continue to be born. Thank you.
theme in late March. We were not sure how we could pull it off and do it, but really, with the amazing talent here in Canberra and everyone here on stage, we did it. They did it because their hearts are in it. So as your president, I wish thank you from the deepest bottom of my heart.
This is a crying moment.
We were all, similar age, we were all in that revolution. Yes, so I wish to thank our writers, directors, performers, and technical support for this presentation, Dr. Merlinda Bobis. Jean Johnston. Dr. Margie Calanda.
Our stage manager.